Welcome back. We've not had a technical video for a few weeks, so this is me trying to catch up. Today, the topic we're covering, to a lot of you, if you're livestock farmers, will seem really basic, I'm sure. Like a lot of the basic stuff, a lot of us get it wrong frequently. And I'm a really big supporter of the idea that with livestock farming, probably in common with a lot of other enterprises, if you get the basics really nailed down, the fundamentals, then most of the other stuff will follow. So the topic, if you're a livestock farmer, at some point the chances are you will have to use an injectable drug, whether that be an antibiotic, an anti-inflammatory, an anti-parasitic drug, or something else. To get that drug into the animal, you will need a needle. So today we're talking about needle choice and needle management. Why does that matter? Why don't you just pick up whatever you have on the shelf? Well, it's to make your life easier and it's to make the animals' lives easier. So you want that drug to get to the right place so it works. Again, that's in your interest and the animals, and you want to avoid any unnecessary discomfort with obvious benefit to the animal, but also to yourself. If you're having to inject a load of lambs, say with a wormer, you don't want them to experience unnecessary discomfort because it's going to make your life harder. They're going to wriggle, they're going to complain, and all you're going to do is make work for yourself. Again, I think it's important to remember that UK farmers are in a relative position of privilege. In some other countries, there are much greater restrictions on the drugs farmers can and can't give themselves. That responsibility that UK farmers have, and abroad, we really need to sort of treat that with respect and a bit of professionalism, in my view. So doing this right, getting these basics and fundamentals right, is part of sort of safeguarding that responsibility. And remember, drugs are designed to work from a certain site because they're absorbed in a predictable way. If we inject them into the wrong site, say a drug that's meant to go into the muscle under the skin, that drug then is absorbed in a much less predictable and possibly less effective way. It also affects the withdrawal times. Some of this is personal preference, so by all means, talk to your vet, get a range of needles, see what's best for you. Just remember that that drug that we're using really does have to go to the right site to work in a predictable way. With regard to how we use needles, there are two fundamental qualities, and one is length and one is gauge. Let's start with length. It's straightforward. For some reason, it's still in imperial units. No idea why that is. In any case, on livestock farms, typically we are using needles that vary between 1/2 inch and 2 inches long. So what determines which needle length we should use? And really, it's two things. It's where is that drug intended to go, which site, and what species and size of animal are we treating. So let's start with intramuscular injections in adult cattle. That's into the muscle. Ideally, you should use an 1.5 inch needle in adult cattle. Now, farmers often look surprised because it seems like a very long needle. It looks a bit brutal. Consider, especially in beef cattle, just how much skin, hair, connective tissue, fatty tissue that needle has actually got to go right through to get to the muscle. If we were treating an adult sheep or a calf, a 1-inch needle would be more suitable. And for very little animals, such as a lamb, you would use a 1/2 inch needle or similar. So that's actually 5/8, but close enough. Moving on to subcutaneous injections, that's under the skin. For adult cattle, typically use something that's 3/4 to 1 inch long. Remember, they've got a thick skin. You want to get right into it. You don't want to inject into the skin. For anything smaller, typically 1/2 inch or so will do. We do get needles that are longer than 1.5 inches. So for example, that is a 2-inch needle. Specifically, as a farm vet, I would use that for injecting cattle into the vein. It's just to get right into the lumen, into the middle of that vein to give calcium normally. Next is gauge, and that is a measure of how thick the needle is or how wide a bore it is. Gauge choice is really determined by two things. One, how hard is that drug to inject? And two, how can we minimize animal discomfort? Remember, nobody likes a prick, but a big prick is probably worse than a little prick. Larger volumes of thicker drugs will be more difficult to inject, and so you will need a thicker needle. The opposite is also true. I'll put a picture up here that I use in some of the medicines courses, illustrating the different gauges we commonly use in farm practice. Confusingly, the higher the number of the gauge, the thinner the needle. Hopefully you can see from that image how a 21 gauge needle would be more appropriate for a little lamb. However, if we're injecting a reasonable volume of a thick solution, such as a penicillin, a 16 gauge needle, for example, might be more appropriate. That 14 gauge weapon on the right, I use for injecting calcium, which comes in a very gloopy solution and also needs to be injected quite rapidly. Another common drug people struggle with is injectable flucosides. Remember, although they're clear, they're often very thick. Remember to get yourself the correct needle at the time so you can inject them easily. As an aside, those thicker solutions, when they're warm, they often pass through the needle much better than when they're very cold. Remember, these sorts of needles are designed for single use. If you're injecting a big group of animals, you can get these slightly sturdier steel lure lock needles, and they should last you a bit longer. How often should you change needles? If you're treating a group of animals, try and change between batches. Set yourself a rational and consistent number of animals at which you will change that needle. Also, if they become visibly broken, blunt, or dirty, just change them. Remember, when we're using these damaged or dirty needles, we increase the risk of the animals wriggling and hurting themselves, and also of starting abscesses. You might also have seen a sterimatic type device used on farm, or even in a previous video of mine. Those are useful tools to try and minimize needle contamination. Where do you get them from? You can get them from several sources. I'm biased. If I were you, I would go to the vet. This is because they will be best placed to advise you on what type of needles you might need for your stock and the drugs you are using. In general, I would just have plenty on hand of a variety of types. For a few quid, it just makes the job a lot more professional and a lot easier for yourself. How to dispose of them? In an ideal world, you will have a sharps box like this. Plenty of our farmers have them. Not necessarily this big, probably take them decades to fill this one, so you can get them much smaller. When they're full, you take them to the vet and they will dispose of them for you. Certainly when we do that for farmers, we also give them a certificate. They can show this certificate to their farm assurance people just to keep things above board. You could use any secure container that's clearly marked. A lot of our farmers also use a tin. Again, the key thing is that they are stored and disposed of safely. They absolutely must never go into the household waste. That's it. Thanks for watching. If you liked that video, press like, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. By all means, leave some questions below. Just remember that your vet will be the best person to ask for anything specific. Stay sharp.